So, considering it took me a very long time to get to this, you can say that, unlike Hawkeye, I wasn't quite on target. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. I haven't talked about Hawkeye. I was so busy catching up with all my 2021 movie reviews and everything else that I had going on over the last few months that totally put me behind that I forgot to do a review of the show. But that's not going to stop me because I aim to eventually have reviews of everything MCU related, and obviously that includes this, so we're going to fix that right now. So before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on Hawkeye were, if you already saw it, or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with more movie and TV related content like Marvel reviews on a near daily basis. But let's not waste any more time and let's talk about Hawkeye. This sees Jeremy Renner reprise his role as former Avenger Clint Barton, who has a seemingly simple mission: get back to his family for Christmas with the help of Kate Bishop, played by Hailee Steinfeld, a 22-year-old archer with dreams of becoming a superhero. The two are forced to work together when a presence from Barton's past threatens to derail far more than the festive spirit. So as I've done previously with my reviews of other TV shows, especially all the Marvel Disney Plus series, this will get into spoilers. So if you have not seen Hawkeye by now and you wish to know absolutely nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Go watch the show, then come back to this. But now that you've been warned, here we go. This was created by Jonathan Ayla, who wrote a few of the episodes, and half the series was directed by Rhys Thomas, while the other half was by the duo Bert and Bertie. And going into this particular series, I admit I was a little hesitant when I very first heard about it. While Jeremy Renner's been great as the character, we also know during the events of Avengers Endgame, he wasn't in such a great spot emotionally, and he got some of the darkest, most brooding material of everyone. And I had heard how some of his time in those 5 years during the Endgame blip was going to be addressed here. So I thought we were going to be in for a possibly sluggish, overly dark entry in the MCU, and given that most of the Disney Plus shows, at least for me, have all just been fine, but didn't necessarily blow me away, with the exception of WandaVision being the only one that I thought was great, this didn't have me overly excited, as I'm not always the biggest fan of all things dark and gritty, especially when it comes to superhero material. There obviously have been some exceptions, but that's just personally not my preference. Well, consider me surprised when we got one look at the trailer at how playful the tone of this was going to be, in the spirit of the holidays. I mean, I know the MCU is mostly known for its jokier tone, but just given how Barton's storyline has been so far, this still was not what I was expecting for this particular series. But it was definitely the right move, as this turned out to be an absolute blast, with its lighthearted tone, which hooks you in right away, given the holiday setting, and the introduction right away of things like Rogers the Musical, which is definitely one of the most ridiculous things we've gotten in the MCU so far for all of its campy energy. Now, despite mostly going for a sense of fun, it's not like we don't explore some weighty emotional material. Like, we see Barton now as a hearing aid, and like I said, we do explore a little more of who he was going up against in his time during the blip. Plus, as we explore the backgrounds of other characters like Kate Bishop, among those who get introduced in the later episodes, there is some emotional weight thrown in there. However, there's definitely a nice balance, with the more lighthearted tone being the more domineering factor, but not to the point that it was ever cartoonish, as it was still centered on characters having meaningful relationships, the main one being between Barton and Bishop. This takes on a classic buddy formula. Once Kate and Clint are introduced at the end of the first episode, they're paired up throughout the remaining 5, in which we get a lot of interaction centered around the over-enthusiastic Kate trying to assist Clint, who tries very unsuccessfully to keep her out of danger. And the chemistry between Jeremy Renner and Hailee Steinfeld is what makes this for me. I thought they were both an absolute blast. As I've said, Renner always has been great as Hawkeye, and it's nice to actually see him take on more of the spotlight after a decade of being in the MCU while never once having had his own series or movie. Meanwhile, Steinfeld radiates such charismatic energy, and she walks the line nicely of being this over-enthusiastic sidekick, but also not to the point of aggravating. Now, I've heard some people say it could be a bit much with the way she can charge into a situation, but for me, she never felt overbearing. She had a great sense of humor, as well as a well-defined arc, and her banter with Renner didn't feel one-sided. They played off one another well, and despite such a familiar setup, it didn't seem like they were forcing these corny interactions just for the sake of a cheap comedic bit. So that banter wound up being a big thing that kept each episode pretty consistently engaging. And I liked how, even within the banter between her and Renner, there's a bit of self-awareness when it comes to the takes on darker, super gritty superhero movies, where it's said no one wants self-seriousness, they want sincerity, which seemed to be Marvel pushing back on the need to always have things to be so dark and gritty, which, if you've been following me, I kind of agree with, especially given how the last few years have been. This embraces the fun energy that you should have, at least to a degree, when it comes to the superhero genre. So I like this one instance of the series acknowledging what it is and having some fun with it, and owning the fact that it can be very endearing without always being super grounded and overly realistic. But as I said, there are still some solid arcs and storylines here. One of the big ones that actually affects multiple characters is the death of Black Widow in Avengers Endgame. We see how Clint is still haunted by that, given how close he was with Natasha. But this really comes to a head when our leads cross paths with easily the best part of the Black Widow movie, and that's the return of Florence Pew as Yelena Belova, who believes Natasha's death was Clint's fault and is now out to kill him. This gets introduced in the latter half of the series, and while I found the show as a whole to be mostly entertaining right out of the gate as a result of the Clint-Kate relationship, this is by far the better of the storylines in the series. Florence Pugh is always fantastic, and similar to Steinfeld, she just finds the right mix of having this tragic, compelling arc, that being motivated by the death of her sister, along with providing some well-timed, substantial comedic relief. The scenes in particular of her with Steinfeld, in which Yelena breaks into Kate's home and confronts her about Barton, were another of the series' brightest spots for me, especially for the way she just always seems to be one step ahead of Kate and always refers to her by her full name. So I really hope we get to see more of these two partnered up in the MCU moving forward, which I'm assuming will be the case whenever we get a new Avengers lineup, or a young Avengers, or whatever team they decide to go with. I know there are a few different versions in the comics, but if we definitely do, then I think this could be one of the most fun relationships driving the MCU forward in the future, especially as we continue moving away a little more from some of the Phase 1 and Phase 2 heroes, and onto the newer generations. The chemistry between Pugh and Steinfeld was very organic, they got some good comedic bits in there, and it never felt like a distraction from the gravity of the current higher stakes situation. So I thought that was all nice. Now, the other big player in this series is Maya Lopez, also known as Echo, played by Alaqua Cox, who's one of the primary enforcers of this mafia that's after Clint. And we also get explorations into her own backstory, as her father was killed by Ronin, which is the alias Clint went under during the 5 years in Endgame, and she's now also out for revenge. And I thought she did a great job. She easily has one of the more tragic arcs, but it's not one that feels tonally disconnected from everything else that's going on with Clint and Kate. Maybe every so often that might be the case, where we go from the much more serious, grounded backstory about Maya and then pivot to the goofy banter between Clint and Kate almost immediately, and it might just be a little off, but it wasn't anything too bothersome, nor did it happen all too often. But I did like how this series managed to tie together so many storylines between the aftermath of Black Widow's death and how it affects Clint, to setting up all of its history with Kate, and introducing two separate revenge tales, one of which isn't until much later on in the show, and it didn't feel overstuffed. A lot of these storylines do converge, with some being one right on top of another. Like when we first get reintroduced to Yelena, it's right after Clint and Kate are fighting Maya, so we are jumping from one thing right to another. But the way we build each of these moments, where we're going back and forth between a few different arcs and storylines, it felt properly built up, as even at only 6 episodes, we spent just the right amount of time we needed with these characters to make it feel satisfying when everything comes to a head. So I gotta give the screenplay for each episode a lot of props for keeping things engaging, yet not too rushed all within just 6 episodes. However, all that being said, I did have some gripes with the show, primarily in its handling of Kate's mother, Eleanor, played by Vera Farmiga. For part of the show, we do see her reduced to a role that's essentially just asking for Kate to stay out of trouble, while a lot of suspicion is being drawn to her new fiance, Jack Duquesne, played by Tony Dalton, who Kate believes is behind the murder of his uncle, which has ties to this mafia that's after Clint. And my issue with this is partially a writing thing, and partially due to the casting itself. The role seemed a little too suspiciously one-note and thankless, especially in relation to Jack, who was a fighter, but they also couldn't pin anything concrete on him, and that suspicion was a major subplot of the show. So there was something that seemed off about the whole thing. Also, with the casting of Vera Farmiga, who's a pretty big name, you don't just bring her in for this thankless sort of role in a Marvel show of all things. I know that's not really what I should be looking at within this critique, and like I said, it is partially within the writing itself, but it just seemed pretty obvious between the nature of this character's role and who it was playing her, that she was probably going to have a much bigger part than she let on. And not in a way where it's revealed she's some sort of hero. And sure enough, it's revealed she's actually the one with the close mafia ties, and she's the one who committed the murder that Jack was framed for. So when we get to that reveal, it really wasn't anything mind-blowing for me, honestly. But at the very least, this did lead to the reintroduction of someone we've all been waiting to see in the MCU proper, and that's Vincent D'Onofrio as Wilson Fisk, aka the Kingpin, returning from the Daredevil show, who's revealed to be the big bad of this show, pulling all the strings while also being Maya's foster uncle. And I was so happy when we got to see him. He played the role exactly in the same way as he did in Daredevil, which right now it's still unsure if the events of that show are also considered canon, but that's a story for another day. And while he doesn't get exactly a ton to do, as he essentially only plays a major part in the final episode, he still had that greater, larger-than-life energy that made him one of the best parts about Daredevil. And considering we got the reveal that he was back the same week as Spider-Man No Way Home, with all the return appearances in that movie, it was a very good week for Marvel, I gotta say. Only thing with him is, though, going hand in hand with that point about him not getting a ton to do, his introduction at the end of the 5th episode, and then getting incapacitated pretty quickly by the end of the final episode, did feel a little anticlimactic. Now, he's definitely not dead. The last you see him, Maya appears to shoot him, but you don't actually see it happen, you just hear the gunshot go off, and the rule typically is, if it occurs off screen, they're probably still alive. Especially because this is one of the most critically acclaimed villains in anything Marvel's ever done, MCU or not, so they wouldn't just set up this big reveal only to then kill him that quickly, so I doubt this is the last we'll see of him. But still, within the context of the show, given how little of a part he ultimately played, it did feel a little anticlimactic, especially with the way his reveal was played up. So that was the only thing about the latter half of the series that disappointed me a bit, but despite being a little let down in that area, that doesn't make the ending of the show itself bad for me, because it still ties everything else together in a mostly satisfying, enjoyable way. It still keeps true to the festive, playful spirit that was established at the beginning, and it did a great job of tying up character arcs and giving a sense of mostly completion, while also leaving things open for more things to come with these characters within the bigger picture of the MCU. You have Clint getting the happy reunion with his family, making peace with the more painful parts of his past, while also having a much stronger bond with Kate, who we know will definitely be back at some point or another in a bigger MCU project, and will eventually be our main Hawkeye. We don't know when she'll show up next, but with all the plans we know or suspect Marvel has lined up in the near future, I'm sure the wait will certainly be worth it. Hawkeye is an absolute blast, and is easily the best of the MCU shows so far. While it's one of the most grounded of these Disney Plus shows, with endearing storylines involving revenge, grief, and making peace with one's past, it still knows how to have a good time, especially thanks to its mostly playful tone, and the great work by Jeremy Renner and Hailee Steinfeld. It does suffer from some storytelling issues in terms of its villains, but they don't totally derail the entire show, with it otherwise sticking the landing to make for one of the most satisfying MCU experiences. Hawkeye gets an 8.5 out of 10. So let me know, did you see Hawkeye, or are you planning to see it, and what are your thoughts? Is this one of your favorite of the MCU shows? Is it one of your least favorite? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.